This is a developing story that has captured the attention of intelligence agencies and political observers across the globe. We are following a narrative so complex, so high stakes, that it challenges the very boundaries of international diplomacy and covert warfare. Reports and allegations have circulated for years, creating a fog of war around one specific, explosive question. Did a sitting president of the United States authorize a clandestine operation to physically kidnap a foreign head of state? The accusations are severe, the implications are historic, and the reality is far more intricate than the headlines suggest. What we are looking at tonight is not just a political rumor, it is a forensic examination of an event that actually took place on the shores of Venezuela. We are dissecting the allegations that Donald Trump, during his presidency, orchestrated a plot to abduct Nicolas Maduro. However, as new details are analyzed and classified contexts are stripped away, a different picture is emerging, one that points away from the Oval Office and toward a chaotic underworld of rogue contractors and failed ambitions. This is breaking news, and it is a story that requires your full attention because the truth exonerates the former president of this specific crime, but the journey to that truth reveals a terrifying gap in global security. For the American public, the idea seems unthinkable, a direct order from the commander-in-chief to snatch a foreign leader. Yet the accusation was made loud and clear by Caracas. But tonight, we are looking at the hard evidence. We are looking at the timeline, the logistics, and the verified intelligence. And what we are finding is that while the animosity between Washington and Caracas was real, the kidnapping plot was not a White House operation. It was something else entirely, something far stranger. We are going live to the details of an investigation that clears the record but exposes a geopolitical thriller that played out in real time. To understand why this distinction matters, why proving the innocence of the Trump administration regarding this botched raid is crucial, we have to go back to the moment the world held its breath. This isn't just about politics. It's about the machinery of the American government versus the actions of private actors. Stay with us. The details of what actually happened on that Venezuelan beach and why the United States government was left in the dark are about to be revealed. This is the story of Operation Gideon, the Silvercorp dossier, and the definitive proof that the orders did not come from the top. The narrative begins not in a secure situation room in Washington, but in the murky, gray waters of the Caribbean. In the early hours of May 2020, the world woke up to images that seemed staged for a movie but were deadly real. Men were paraded on Venezuelan state television, hands bound, identifying themselves as Americans. They were not tourists, they were former Green Berets. The Venezuelan government immediately seized upon this visual, broadcasting it to the world as proof of a Bay of Pigs style invasion authorized by Donald Trump. The narrative was set instantly. The Yankee imperialist had tried to kidnap the president of Venezuela. But as the dust settled and intelligence analysts began to pick apart the debris of this failed incursion, the official narrative began to crumble. The operation, known as Operation Gideon, was a tactical disaster from the very first second. It lacked air support. It lacked heavy weaponry. It lacked the sophisticated communications blackout that accompanies every single authorized U.S. Special Operations mission. This was the first major clue that the narrative of a Trump-ordered kidnapping was flawed. The United States military is the most powerful fighting force in human history. When it moves, the world shakes. This operation, by contrast, was silent, clumsy, and catastrophically under-resourced. We must look closely at the atmosphere in Washington at the time. There is no denying that the Trump administration had placed maximum pressure on the Maduro regime. Sanctions were tightening. Rhetoric was heating up. The Department of Justice had indeed unsealed an indictment against Maduro, charging him with narco-terrorism and placing a $15 million reward for information leading to his arrest or conviction. This is a critical distinction that often gets lost in the noise of breaking news. Placing a legal bounty and seeking an arrest through international law is a judicial process. Setting mercenaries to storm a palace and stuff a president into a plane is a war crime. The media and the Venezuelan government conflated the two, but the evidence draws a sharp, undeniable line between them. The confusion stems from the involvement of a private security firm, Silvercorp USA, run by Jordan Goudreau, a decorated veteran whose post-military career took a erratic turn. Goudreau claimed he had a contract. He claimed he was liberating Venezuela. But as we dig deeper into the communications between Goudreau and the Trump administration, the connection snaps. Investigations have shown that while Goudreau desperately tried to court interest from Washington, he was repeatedly rebuffed. The White House, the CIA, and the State Department were not managing this operation. In fact, intelligence suggests they were unaware of its specific execution until the disaster unfolded on live television. This is where the story pivots from a political scandal to a case of rogue ambition. The men on that boat were not operating under Title 50 covert action authorities. They were not carrying orders signed by the president. They were operating on the promises of a private contract that had no backing from the U.S. Treasury. If Donald Trump had intended to remove Nicolas Maduro by force, military analysts agree unanimously on one thing. The result would not have been a handful of men captured by local fishermen. The sheer incompetence of the raid is, ironically, the strongest initial evidence of the president's innocence. But we need more than just logical deduction. We need to look at the reaction from within the Oval Office when the news broke. Sources close to the administration described a scene of confusion, not a cover-up. The president's public statement, "If I wanted to go into Venezuela, I wouldn't make a secret about it," was criticized for its bravado, but it held a core of strategic truth. The Trump doctrine, for all its unpredictability, relied heavily on overwhelming force and transactional leverage, not on underfunded high-risk guerrilla tactics led by private citizens. The disconnect between the president's style of governance and the reality of Operation Gideon is absolute. Let's go deeper into the smoking gun that never was. In the weeks following the failed raid, documents were leaked, contracts were shown, and audio recordings surfaced. The Venezuelan government produced a document allegedly bearing Donald Trump's signature. It was a moment of peak tension. If genuine, it would have been an act of war. However, forensic analysis and scrutiny by U.S. intelligence officials quickly debunked the validity of the document as a binding presidential order. It was part of a pitch deck, a proposed agreement between opposition figures and a private contractor, not a directive from the executive branch. The signature of the President of the United States authorizes drone strikes and troop movements. It does not appear on consulting contracts for Florida-based security startups. The media frenzy that followed played into the hands of the Maduro regime. It was a perfect propaganda victory. Portray the chaotic failure of a few desperate men as the failure of the American president. But tonight, we are correcting that record. We are separating the geopolitical hostility, which was very real, from the criminal act of kidnapping, which was a fabrication. The United States government, under Trump, was using economic strangulation and legal indictments, tools of statecraft. They were not using Jordan Goudreau's fishing boats. The tragedy of this situation lies in the human cost and the diplomatic fallout, but the legal reality remains clear. The Department of Justice, the same body that indicted Maduro, launched an investigation into the organizers of the raid. If this had been a government-sanctioned black op, the organizers would have been protected, shielded by classified status. Instead, they faced federal charges in the United States. This is the ultimate proof of the administration's non-involvement. The U.S. government does not arrest its own assets for carrying out the president's orders. They arrested them because they violated the Neutrality Act, acting as rogue agents outside the authority of the United States. As we peel back the layers of this international incident, we find a story of delusion rather than conspiracy. We see private actors who believed they could alter the course of history and cash in on a multi-million-dollar bounty, misinterpreting the political climate as a green light. They were wrong, and in their failure, they cast a shadow over the White House that has taken years to dissipate. But the facts, cold and hard, tell us that the command and control never touched the resolute desk. To understand the full scope of why this exoneration is important, we have to look at the broader context of U.S.-Latin American relations during that period. The tension was palpable. The rhetoric was aggressive, but there is a massive chasm between aggressive diplomacy and state-sponsored kidnapping. Crossing that line would have destroyed the U.S.'s standing in the Western Hemisphere for generations. The Trump administration, for all its aggressive posturing, understood that red line. The kidnapping was a myth born out of a botched private enterprise, fueled by a regime desperate for a victim narrative. This story is far from over. As we continue to examine the files and the testimonies of those currently imprisoned in Venezuela, the separation between the U.S. government and the conspirators becomes wider. The narrative of the Trump kidnapping plot is dissolving under the weight of evidence, replaced by a grittier, more pathetic reality of modern mercenary warfare. But there are still questions that need answering. How did these men get as far as they did? Who financed the initial stages, if not the government? We are going to pause here for a moment, but do not turn away. When we continue, we will dive into the specific legal arguments that shattered the conspiracy theory, and we will hear, through the record, the voices of the men who were left behind, and why their abandonment is the final nail in the coffin of the theory that they were working for the president. This is a story of betrayal, but not the one you were told. We established the operational disconnection between the White House and the chaotic beach landing in Venezuela. But to truly prove the innocence of the former president regarding the charge of kidnapping, we must turn our eyes to the most unyielding evidence available, the reaction of the United States legal system. If Operation Gideon had been a sanctioned black op, a mission ordered by the president under covert action statutes, the aftermath would have been shrouded in silence. The State Department would have invoked diplomatic immunity. The CIA would have scrubbed records. The Department of Justice would have stepped in to classify the proceedings in the name of national security. That is how the machinery of state protects its own. But that is not what happened. Instead, federal prosecutors in the United States moved with swift and aggressive precision against the organizers of the raid. The Department of Justice unsealed charges against Jordan Goudreau and his associates for violating the Neutrality Act, a law explicitly designed to prevent private citizens from launching wars against nations with whom the United States is at peace. This legal action is the smoking gun of Trump's non-involvement. The United States government does not prosecute its own agents for following orders. By charging these men, the Trump administration's own Justice Department effectively declared them outlaws, rogue actors who had usurped the state's monopoly on violence. This legal reality shatters the conspiracy theory. You cannot simultaneously order a man to kidnap a foreign leader and then throw him in federal prison for attempting to do it. The prosecution serves as the definitive firewall, separating the executive branch from the private catastrophe of Silvercorp USA. Yet, beyond the legal briefs and courtrooms, there is a human tragedy that further illuminates the lack of official support. We must look at the men currently sitting in the helicoid prison in Caracas, Luke Denman and Aaron Berry. These were not top-tier, Tier 1 operators deployed with the full might of the Joint Special Operations Command. Interviews and interrogations reveal a much sadder truth. They were men who believed they were helping a just cause, misled by their commanders into thinking they had government backing that never existed. In the world of covert operations, deniability is a standard term, but abandonment is not. If these men were operating on presidential orders, there would be back-channel negotiations, prisoner swaps, or leverage applied immediately. Instead, they were left to the mercy of the Venezuelan judicial system. Their isolation is a testament to the fact that they were not soldiers of the state, but contractors of a failed private venture. The silence from Washington wasn't a cover-up. It was the silence of a government that had nothing to do with the mission and no legal footing to demand their release as official combatants. So, if Donald Trump didn't order this, who pulled the strings? The trail leads away from the Potomac and straight into the fractured heart of the Venezuelan opposition. Documents recovered during the investigation point to a strategic committee, formed by opposition figures desperate to break the stalemate in Venezuela. It was here, in the frantic grasp for power, that the contract was born. It was a deal signed not in the Oval Office, but in Miami condos and Bogota hotels. This distinction is vital for history. The Trump administration's policy was maximum pressure, economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the recognition of Juan Guaido. It was a strategy of attrition, not extraction. Intelligence analysts have noted that a kidnapping attempts carries a risk-to-reward ratio that no sitting U.S. president would authorize in this context. If Maduro had been killed or kidnapped, the resulting power vacuum could have plunged the region into a civil war that would destabilize the entire hemisphere. Donald Trump, a man known for his aversion to new foreign wars, would not have signed off on a suicide mission that offered zero strategic guarantee. The fallout of this event, however, was catastrophic. And this brings us to the ultimate irony: the kidnapping plot. That Trump was accused of actually strengthened the very man he wanted to remove. Nicolas Maduro used the raid to purge his military, tighten his grip on power, and paint himself as the survivor of American imperialism. If this was a Trump plan, it was the greatest act of self-sabotage in modern diplomatic history. The reality is simpler. It was a gift to Maduro, wrapped in the incompetence of private mercenaries. As we reach the end of this investigation, the fog clears. We are left with a picture of a chaotic world where private military companies, fueled by ambition and unchecked by government oversight, can nearly trigger an international war. The accusation that Donald Trump kidnapped Venezuela's president is not just false. It is a distraction from the terrifying reality that, in the 21st century, anyone with enough money and a few former soldiers can try to rewrite history. The Trump kidnapping was a headline, a rumor, a political weapon. But it was not a fact. The facts show a president who used the pen of sanctions, not the sword of mercenaries. The facts show a Justice Department that prosecuted the conspirators. The facts show 2 Americans sitting in a foreign cell, victims not of a presidential order, but of a lie told by their private commanders. In the end, this story serves as a warning. It reminds us that in the shadows of geopolitics, not everything is a grand conspiracy orchestrated from the top. Sometimes it is just greed, delusion, and failure. The United States government did not kidnap Nicolas Maduro. Donald Trump is innocent of this charge. But the world came dangerously close to the edge, not because of a president's order, but because of the dangerous belief that war can be privatized. And as the sun sets over the Caribbean, the waters remain silent, keeping the secrets of what might have been and the hard truth of what actually was. This is the reality. This is the record. And now,